Hey everyone, Corey from AquariumCoop.com here with Joel Corvus Oskin of Real Fish Talk and his own YouTube channel. I just want to start off today by saying the internet is being wonky. We had some terrible storms last night, and Joel's connection's a little shifty, mine's a little shifty, but we're gonna go on with it, and hopefully it is just good. So
Yeah, we had those 60-mile-an-hour winds and stuff yesterday, and I believe there was one of the school weather readout things said that we got 3 inches of rain yesterday in a day, which is pretty crazy.
the funny part was I told Jimmy, because Jimmy was like, I thought it rained here all the time. And I'm like, I think we're having like a record low rain pattern, and then it dumped 3 inches yesterday, so it caught back up.
Yeah, definitely. It's been like that, and it does rain a lot here. I guess, but normally when it rains a lot here, it's just like that drizzle. You'll get 14 hours of drizzle or 4 days worth of drizzle.
Yeah. So today we're talking about fungal infections, and I've been seeing it a lot in the aquarium group support, which is for lack of a better term, the Facebook group associated with my business. And I see it happening a lot. And for me, I guess a fungal infection starts at usually, where did we go wrong? Is it there's the wrong fish? So they're beating on each other? Is it the wrong environmental conditions? And so it seems like, how are you going to fill an hour with that? Well, if we just say use antifungal medication, that is one step, right? That technically will work probably, but that doesn't go towards addressing the problem at all. So,
Right.
So first, I think we should talk about, if we have fungus, how do we get rid of it? And then we'll spend lots of time either answering questions or talking about how do we prevent fungus, because I think I'm seeing a lot of the fungal infections that I see, at least in the group and stuff, a lot of it looks totally preventable. Not everything's preventable. Like sometimes you're just like, oh man, there's a fungus among us, but
Yeah,
so.
occasionally a fungus will just take hold, just
Mhm.
kind of randomly, and that'll just be a portion of that's just sort of like, you got to just equate to life, that fungus is around, and sometimes it will just take hold, but 90% of the time it's pretty preventable,
Yeah.
realistically.
So I'm trying to think for my method of, if I get fungus, I've got two ways I treat it. One would be salt. If I don't have a planted aquarium or I have a quarantine tank, I will use salt depending on the species. Like some species are going to be more tolerant to salt than others. Some of the ones that I do like to use salt with would be like bettas, goldfish, even most tetras, barbs, danios. Cory cats, I try not to use too much salt. Most catfish in general, I guess. Plecos I will, though. And I'll go anywhere from like a tablespoon per 3 gallons or so to a tablespoon per gallon with species. And like goldfish and koi, they could go even higher than that. But I start low. And a lot of times it'll be in conjunction with, like, oh, I'm going to put some salt in, and I'm going to use, and for me, I like to use ICX, which that's always like the first tripping point for everyone. They're like, but it's not ick. And I go, yes, I realize this, but the chemicals or medicines, or however you want to put it, used in ICX also, for me, work really well against funguses. It's got like methylene blue, and I can't remember all the other stuff it has, but in my experience, wham, those two work really well against most funguses for me. When you get fungus, what do you do?
Typically, as you know, my treatment's a little bit different than yours, but I do always start with salt in regards to fungus types things. Any kind of mysterious fungus that would be going on. I definitely start with a salt treatment, and like you said, tablespoon per 10 gallons. So pretty easy.
You go real mild. I just go straight for the throat.
Well, I go pretty easy to start out, and then I'll work my way up over like a 3 or 4 day period. And in conjunction with that, I'll raise the temperature a little bit. because the temperature raised will increase their metabolism in the fish, so the salt will actually be a little more effective if the temperature is raised. But I don't want to go from, say, like 72 degrees to 93, right, in one day.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just up the ante over like a 3 or 4 day period. So like each day I'll add more salt and a little more temperature. And the rule that I go by is 1 tablespoon per 10 gallons. But I mean, I'll get to probably half of the dosing, like you said, over that like a 4 day period.
Yeah, ramping it up. Yeah.
Yeah, just ramping it up. I'll get to about half of because you're saying 1 tablespoon per gallon, right?
I can get up to that. That's
up to that. Okay.
Too much past that, and a lot of species like tetras and that kind of stuff, I find just really don't respond well. And it's kind of a catch-22 of like, clearly they're not responding well to fungal infections. So it's like, do I let the fungal infection linger even longer, or do I hit them with more salt to kill that fungal infection, knowing they don't like the salt either? But I feel like once you get rid of the fungus, you can just water change and get rid of salt. I can't just water change and get rid of fungus. So.
Right. Yeah. I I have a tendency to treat over a longer period. As just kind of my typical behavior, right? And that would be mainly because I would say that, like, for instance, I don't own a store. You know what I mean? So for me, it's not, it's not at the DEFCON 4 elevated. Like I got to get it quick.
Sirens going off and the neighbors complain.
DEFCON 4. right. We're in code orange. Everybody freaking out.
Yeah.
But you see, like in your situation, you have a store, so you're trying to stomp it out super quick. For me, like, and so my hobby tanks and stuff like that, I kind of go that little bit slower route in hopes to not necessarily like over affect the fish too much over a real quick period. Mainly because I just have more time, right?
Sure.
If you, and typically like my tanks are pretty understocked, whereas you would probably have tanks that are more overly stocked, not overstocked, but heavier stocking. There we go. That's the right word. So it would be more advantageous for you with a heavier stock tank to go quickly because you have more fish in there. I have a lot less fish, and as you know, my plants come in #1, and all my tanks are planted. So I never really have the option of like, just throw chemicals in there and hope for the best. So that's kind of why I go a little bit differently, because most of my tanks are all planted and stuff like that. I don't have any holding tanks per se. So, but if I was to go chemical, I typically would go with either ICX or Melifix, whichever ones I happen to have. I don't necessarily think one is realistically better than the other, but that's just like my personal kind of, it's like, hey, is one better? I just whichever one I got, will be the one that I would go to. But yeah, ICX does work great. And I know that a lot of people out there, like you said, would be like, well, that's not fungus, that's ick. Well, ick is pretty darn close because it's bacterial. So realistically on the spectrum, they're pretty close to each other. You know what I mean? They're not that far off, Well,
right. I mean, it's one of those things that when you start talking about fungal infections, bacterial infections, parasites, the problem is it's kind of a melting pot. So for instance, one of the next parts we're going to talk about after, I just want to give a little preview to it, is once you get rid of the fungal infection, typically you're going to leave behind a bacterial infection. And so that is problematic in its own thing. But we've got some questions about salt. One, they want us to clarify salt. So right now I'm talking about, I'm not going to say pure, but basically just NaCl, aquarium salt. You can get it from Home Depot, like just salt, like not marine salt, not kosher salt, not pickling salt, like just NaCl. And that makes it sound more confusing, NaCl, when really it's not any more confusing. It just, that is what salt is. And then this question I like, that I think we can go a little bit more in depth on salt, which we weren't meaning to go too in depth on salt, but it seems appropriate. Kevin Keener asks, why is salt dosing in freshwater so vague? Seems like saltwater guys have to dial it in so much more. Is there any certain gravity for freshwater dosing?
Oh, for freshwater salt dosing?
Yeah.
Well, not typically, because in most freshwater environments, there just typically is no salt. So you're basically just, if you were to dose and have a specific gravity to look for, it would just be 0. Now, as you kind of move into brackish fish and all that kind of stuff, then there definitely are specific gravities for certain areas. But if you're talking about brackish water, you have a big window. You realistically have a really big window for those fish to essentially live a healthy life, because they are able to kind of convert to whatever salinity is going on, and that's the natural environment where they've grown up. So if you're looking for a specific gravity for freshwater, it's 0. You just essentially, you want 0 is what should be reading on your
Well, I think he's talking about when using medications, and I think the problem is, 98% of all freshwater hobbyists don't own a hydrometer. So
or a refractometer.
Right. So it's going to be really hard to measure salt. And then on top of that, when we're talking about, like, let's say 1 tablespoon per 3 gallons, that's such a low salinity or specific gravity that unless you have a refractometer, it's not even going to pick it up.
Right.
So that's like problematic in its own right.
You and I really like to use the food analogies, right? Because we're both way into that.
I do like the foods.
So here's a quick food analogy that will make sense. When cooking savory food like dinner, like tacos, or you're going to make a delicious spaghetti sauce, right? That's more like freshwater, because you're just going to add a little bit, right? You're like, to taste. How much salt should be in here to taste? Whereas in baking, so if you're going to bake a cake and all that kind of stuff, you'd actually be measuring that out per gram. Like you'd get one of those, and I don't have a better way to put this, but it's like those drug scales, where you're scaling out stuff. Use those in baking all the time, because you need to be perfectly exact. So that would be sort of reef, right? So in the reef and salt water, it's sort of like baking. You got to be kind of perfect and right on. I think a lot of people out there know, I use a refractometer to find out my exact gravity. Total nerd. It's a nerd tool, but they're actually super cheap now. So you can actually, grab one of those off Amazon or whatever if you want.
I thought the cheapest ones were like $80.
They used to be super expensive. Now I think the last one I got was like $15.99, which is like hilarious.
I should own one now. Because I was not. They're not worth $80 to me, but $15, that's worth having.
Yeah, you're like, let me just one click this thing, and somebody will bring it someday. So I think that would be kind of the food analogy with that. Whereas like freshwater, you're kind of just adding to taste to kind of knock back whatever was going on. You don't need to be perfectly on point. Whereas, a reef tank, you want to be as close as possible. So that's more like baking, so hopefully that answers why that is the way it is. It's sort of.
And I did think of a realm in the freshwater world where they do use specific gravity, and that is in the koi and goldfish realm, because they can use so much salt and they'll tolerate it. A lot of times you'll see. So I guess the first thing is most people don't have a way to measure salinity. So that's why it becomes put this amount per this many gallons. And in the koi and goldfish world, usually that was 4 pounds per 100 gallons. And the reason why that measurement, you're like, wait, that's not tablespoons, that's not cups, that's not specific gravity, because most koi people, and this is most, we're overgeneralizing here, have even less equipment to measure things than an aquarist does. So then everyone, pretty much, we assume everyone has a scale that can measure pounds, and they're doing really big volumes of water. And so 4 pounds per 100 gallons, I think also roughly translates to 4% salinity or something like that. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. Is it 0.04? Yeah. And
0.0004.
0.004, which you can also measure with a pond hydrometer, which if you ever get your hands on a pond hydrometer versus a saltwater one, the measurements are just much smaller. So like, I think the first one on a saltwater one is like 0.01 or something like that. And then like on the pond one, it's like 0.0001. Like it's way smaller fraction of percent. So yeah, I can think of different measurements, and I think it's purely for, stores and people trying to help kind of go like, what's your situation? All right, just put, how do you have to measure? All right, a cup? Sure. Okay. In your 55-gallon tank, let's do like half a cup. It's a lot of guesstimating. And then you've got the whole aspect of like in salt water, it's so specific because if you get outside of that salt, stuff just dies. In freshwater, you've got things like that I learned, like a dwarf anchor catfish. If you eat a taco and sneeze into the tank, there's enough salt there that it like kills those catfish. The smallest amount takes out dwarf anchor cats in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could put more salt than water in a goldfish tank and they'll probably endure it. So it's like, that's why there's just so much variance, and not like it. If it was one dose, like, oh yeah, it's 1 tablespoon per 3.5 gallons, and that worked for everything, that would just become the known metric. But because there are so many different ways, and we're talking about tablespoons and cups and things like that, and pounds, and then you've got the whole worldwide factor of like, well, how many how many kilos or how many are we going to add of everything? So it starts getting even more difficult. And is salinity? I haven't thought about that. Salinity is just salinity, right? Like whether you're in America or the United States or world, right? It's just 0.0026.
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so.
So it's a universal.
I've never seen anything else that I can think of. I know pretty. Yeah, I think pretty often everything has been,
because everything else, heat, length of tank, everything else is different, but salt is just the same worldwide.
Well, most things worldwide scientifically are the same, because they'll figure out how to use a specific scale, and then no one will really get a variance away from there.
pH is universal. Partially and not exactly. Like TDS and microspecimens are different, but yeah, so there's more than just salt, but yeah, okay.
But like, for instance, it's like naming things in Latin, right? So that everyone knows what you're talking about specifically. So I think it's along those lines. But in my experience, the reason why koi ponds and things like that, why koi and larger fish keepers do things in pounds, is because if you started talking about cups or liters,
tablespoons
or any of the, or liters or anything like that, you'd be measuring all day long.
Yeah.
So let's say you had a 10,000 gallon pond. You need 4 pounds per 100 gallons. Then you need 400 pounds, which means you need 4 cases of salt. And then each case of salt, they come in a 40-pound box, and then you'll dump each box in there. Whereas if you said how many cups you need, there would be a guy standing over there all day long counting out
you
cups.
Need 3 weeks worth. Like he's going to stand there for 3 weeks, and that'll be enough.
Right. It's going to be 120 hours of labor, or some guy losing count all day long.
Yeah.
So that's generally why. It's just you're getting into bigger volumes, so it's much easier per pound to just measure it out that way. Because like I said, they come in 40-pound boxes, just like butter. Butter comes in 40-pound boxes also.
So we've got a couple of super chats here. Big Bob has donated $8 to the Comeback to Michigan Fund. All right, we'll squirrel that down. Yeah, that's right, squirrel it down. Not we
got super chats. Are we on YouTube or are we on Facebook?
We're on the YouTubes because the Wirecast is so broken from their update, we couldn't get it to work. So we're just on the.
We're on the YouTubes. Okay,
we're on the YouTubes currently, and then we have Brendan's Life, who brought an appropriate question to the fungal panel, if you will.
The panel.
Yes, if you will. I find salt doesn't work since I'm on a water softener. Though I will say fungal infection is rare, it really only happens in older fish. I wonder if the salt helps keep it at bay, and what do you think? And it's a $10 super chat. So I do think you're probably keeping some fungal infections at bay, because it doesn't take a whole lot of salt to really keep fungal infections in check. But you probably also struggle a little bit with live plants, because that salt is, helping on one end, hurting on the other a little bit. And what was the other part here? It only happens in older fish. So that's a great segue to our next thing, and that is what's causing these fungal infections. Now, let's just say there's 10% that's just happen chance, random, like, that's you're the person that works out every day, you do 2 hours of cardio, you eat perfect, and for whatever reason you still get sick. Like that's just yep, there's X amount, but we can, I guess, hedge our bets where if I exercised a ton, I ate super healthy, I made sure I was getting all the vitamins I need, I'm less likely to get sick. And so I think in an older fish, we're going to express things like a nutrient deficiency. So, let's say they were eating the same flake food for 8 years straight. I would wager we're lacking some kind of nutrient in that diet. Even as complete as we think we make fish foods, we can't make one that covers everything, no matter how much companies claim we can.
Right. Just the same with people, though. You also need to have a varied diet, and you definitely need a varied diet with fish also. And that was one of the things that I didn't quite get to when I was talking about my specific treatment was raising the salt, raising the temperature, and as you raise the temperature, you also need to raise your feeding because their metabolism is going to pick up, and essentially they're going to start burning through stuff more rapidly. And that's something that you're going to need to do. And as you were saying, you'll also need to supplement a little bit to their diet because they may be missing something that may have allowed them to get this infection in the first place. It's a great point that you mentioned. Sometimes we all just get sick. Sometimes you're just going to get the cold, you're going to get the flu, and all the animals out there in the world will sometimes fall prey to things just by the poor luck of the draw. So, but the best thing one of the reasons that we treat is to make sure that that doesn't spread, because once that starts to get a foothold, one of the sources oftentimes could just be an old fish that has a bad immune system, that kind of stuff, gets sick. And then now, whether it's bacterial or fungal, now it's starting to spread, right? Because now it has a growth source. It has an area where it's growing. It has availability. So that's one thing I always try to mention to people is that as you bring up that temperature, now it's time to introduce some other food. It's always good to add something that does have a little bit of garlic in it. That is always helpful. And increase smaller feedings throughout this warmer temperature now that their temperature is higher. So let's say you feed once a day. Now it would be a great time to feed at least in the morning and when you get home from work or something like that. I try to feed every 8 hours when I'm treating like this and the temperature is much higher. I try to do a morning feeding, then go off work for the day, come home, do an afternoon feeding, and then something right before bed. And I try to mix it up with against my normal feeding stuff. I try to add in some other things. And from there, that's always a great point too, to remind people that on your typical feeding schedule, always try to change off. I have 3 foods I generally feed, and I just alternate them throughout the week, basically.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to point out is sometimes when fish are sick, they don't even want to eat. And so it becomes more and more important to get like quality food in there. And people assume I'm talking about like, well, what food is the quality food? And really what I'm talking about is like fresh, So if we know, like, let's say I've got the flu and my wife's taking care of me and I can't keep anything down, I'm puking, I don't feel good. Like, it's really important that maybe I get like some banana in me and some toast, like stuff that I might be able to keep in and will offer some nutrients to my body. And so same thing, if we have a fish that is obviously struggling and then we give it food, we want to make sure that like that flake food's not 18 months old sitting out on the shelf in the sun, so making sure that it is nutrient packed. And you could, something with garlic in it typically is a appetite attractant. That's the main lure of garlic for manufacturers, is you put a bunch of garlic in food, fish tend to want to eat it. And that's helpful when you have a fish that's sick. When it comes to other things you could do, you could use a vitamin soak. I know some people have been talking about that lately. And like I saw that on the website, and I use it for puffers a lot because puffers, like they only like to eat clams and a few other things. And so it can be really, hard to get those nutrients into the puffer fish or whatever fish you're looking at. So soaking it in things that, 1, help appetite, 2, bring nutrients to it. And that kind of just make sure the fish has the pieces it needs to fight off this fungal infection. Because just because we are treating it with meds or salt doesn't mean it's not just going to come straight back or something like that. If it's a super weak immune system, the first goal is build that back up.
Yeah, and that's for sure. Especially one of the reasons I bring up garlic is it's a fantastic way for people to actually treat fungal and stuff like that. Most people don't like to talk about people fungal infections, but we all have it. It's just whether or not your body's going to keep it at bay. And one of the great additives that could help actual people is at introducing a ton of raw garlic into your diet. Also, if you want to keep your fungal infections at bay, that is a great way to do that. It's quite the helpful little one that garlic is, and as you said, it does cause the fish to actually pick up a little bit of appetite and get a little more food in them, and that's realistically, as you said, like the goal when we're trying to add some nutrients to these fish, get them a little bit healthier. Like a great example, like you were talking about, get a little toast in you or that kind of stuff. Sometimes you get super sick. It's like it's time to get some bone broth, even some chicken stock or some beef stock or whatever. If you've been hung up and sick for a week, you know what it's like to actually be able to down a cup of that. All of a sudden you feel like Superman and you could take over the world. So that's the same thing for these fish. And oftentimes, because the fish can't communicate with us, they are constantly 24 hours a day swimming around, essentially. They're always in a state of, physically moving and doing that kind of stuff and can't necessarily communicate that they haven't been feeling well. So one of the foods that I use almost all the time is the New Life Spectrum. What is it? The
Thera A, maybe?
The
with
Thera
the
A.
garlic?
Yeah, I use the Thera A almost all the time. I try to make sure I get some of that into my tanks like every week. At least once a week, I get some of that thrown in there. That's my favorite garlic one. And mainly because I'm always behind the times on food, because when I find a food that I really like, I just kind of stick with it. Some people know out there that I trying out some new shrimp food, and as you guys know me, I'm always like, no, I got to stay stubborn and stick with the stuff that I like, right? That's my American side, right? I got loyalty, I got brand loyalty, but there are a ton of good products out there nowadays as far as the garlic food and stuff like that. So it's not hard to find anymore. You don't have to necessarily like make your own or anything like that, which in the past was like, even as a professional chef, it's like, oh, I got to make my own fish food. What?
Yeah. So we're at the halfway mark. I want to ask everyone today. The big ask is share this live stream out. Let's pick up like 5 new people watching / listening to the podcast. You could, if you don't want to do that, maybe your friends are precious on the Spacebooks or whatever platform you're on. You could consider buying from the aquariumcoop.com. That helps fund the show. Or you could donate through Patreon, which Joel is on Patreon and I'm on Patreon. And you could make like a $1 donation and makes the show go round. We did get Joel a brand new mic, but we already were having problems and the power was going out, so it is not ready for today. But in theory, if this sound is okay to you, sound is about to get even a little better. And if you're watching us on YouTube right now, you're going, it's fine. But it becomes really apparent when you're at work working and you're only listening. Everything in the background you actually do hear and stuff like that. So we're trying to improve for everyone. And thank you to all the mods, Candy, Glass Boxes, Dwayne Kitchell, Danny's Aquariums. There's probably a couple of more in here that I have missed at this point, but hey, no slight on you. Just keeping the show rolling. What I do want to talk about is...
Oh, yeah, don't forget the Nightbot.
Yeah. Somehow I'm choking on my own spit. Hold on. I'm dying.
Are you dying? Don't die.
I am.
Hey, we got things to do later. Don't die right now.
Yes, Nisi is here as well, and she reminded me of the podcast 10. There's no space in that, so podcast 10, all one word, gets you 10% off of your purchase at my store, aquariumcoop.com, and 5% goes to the show here. And part of that, we now, well, it's not, I don't know what the right word is, syndicated or whatever you want to call it, but we are now paying. This was the hang up. People were like, why aren't you on iHeartRadio? And I'm like, I am. I submitted it through our podcasting service. Turns out you have to pay to be on iHeartRadio. So we are now paying to be there, but we're still in the manual review process. So they got to listen and make sure we're not doing something horrible before they allow us to the masses, which, you know, there's a fair chance they might go, oh, this was horrible, we can't allow this. But, you know, so that should be coming soon. People were asking for it, and that's kind of what we try and do. Like, we garner some money, and then people ask us to do stuff, and then we plug that money into that stuff. So
yeah, that's been the ongoing. That's always the conundrum, is that people are like, yeah, what are you talking about? You guys are trying to get money. It's like, yeah, well, all this stuff costs money to operate. And that's the unfortunate part. It's like, I wish, you know, like you said, the iHeartRadio, we have to pay to get everything hosted up on there. And that's just one of the many that people use, like iTunes. Always remember to go, maybe you're not even an iTunes user, but, you know, pop on there with somebody's computer that, you know,
yeah, take over your grandma's
maybe
computer.
not yours. Take over your grandma's computer. Go on there. Give us a subscription, and throw a review on there that just says Joel is the coolest guy ever in the whole entire history of time, and and that's it right there.
Yeah. So now that we're in the second part of the show, let's talk about more preventative for the fungal infection. One that I see very often, well, two of the fish I see very, very often is bettas and guppies. And so for bettas, I think, you know, let's touch on the elephant in the room, and that is X amount of bettas live in this water bottle essentially with no heat, poor circulation, and then they buy a bottle of betta food that lasts 6 years. So like there's obviously we could probably identify like 4 things wrong with that demonstration, and yet that is kind of a truth that is going to happen. So, you know, where I see it in bettas a lot of times, we come out of the summer, and this is why I'm seeing it so much right now, is fungal infections typically are in this cold period. So we come out of summer, either we don't have a heater or the heater stops working, fish get more lethargic. And so with a betta, they might be laying on something, you know, their fins are touching something, and bacteria can set in, and that's the catalyst for starting that fungal infection. So when it comes to bettas and preventative, I think keeping that metabolism up and keeping it a little bit warmer, you know, it doesn't have to be 82, but at the same time, we should be 68. You know, I'd say there's quite a range in there. I myself shoot for 76 to 80, somewhere in there for my betta. With in a perfect world, I would say like, yeah, just sits at 80, loves life, gets frozen food and live foods every day. But in a practical scenario, maybe that's not the case. And, you know, enough water volume to manage the waste. You know, a lot of people say, well, I'll just change water all the time. And that is stressful, in my opinion. If you change, you know, if you change water every second day, that's pretty stressful on the fish as well. So what I know you were a big betta guy, and you might even be.
I am still.
Oh, still big betta guy.
I'm still a big beta guy. I haven't lost my fanhood.
All right.
I haven't lost my fanhood of the betas. I love them.
So what is your preferred way of treating fungal? And then where did you see that crop up the most in bettas? Like, I'm thinking breeding?
Well, we're talking production or prevention, right? Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, it actually, I always found it was pretty easy to avoid fungal with my betas because, as you said, I didn't keep them in a water bottle. It was pretty rare for me to ever have anything beta-wise in anything less. I think the smallest I ever went was like 5.5 gallons, and it just didn't seem right. I actually upgraded them to 10 gallons. And I generally kept most of my fish in relatively larger volumes of water. That was probably the biggest prevention. Almost always heavily planted with at least some kind of floater in there. That'll definitely pick up a lot of the waste and stuff like that. And as you said, temperature was almost always the biggest problem with maintaining a good health with your beta. And that realistically is just not too high and not too low, and just really kind of honestly staying in that middle area. And then for me, over a long periods of time, I started to realize that the more I paid attention to my plant health, as far as my plants had kind of proper nutrients and things were going on, like I didn't have any yellowing or any holes in my plants or anything like that, then my betas were pretty much right in line with how the plants were doing. If my plants were doing well and things were pretty stable in the tank and nice for most of the sort of middle ground plants, nothing like, HC or anything goofy like that where you're looking for weird water parameters. But if my plants were actually doing pretty well and staying healthy and being fertilized properly and that kind of stuff, then generally my betas were healthy. I mean, obviously it's not like, hey, if I got one plant growing perfectly here, my betas will be fine. And then I was realistically, I only ever really did once a week with any kind of live food or bloodworms or anything like that. And more often than not, I was, I sound like a one-trick pony right now, but more often than not, if I was just doing kind of daily feeding pellets and stuff like that, it was the New Line Spectrum, the Thera A, the one with the garlic in it. I pretty regularly gave them that, and that seemed to work out pretty well. As you said, with the fungal, it would generally show up, as you said, around breeding time, and it was more often than not having to do with just the stress of breeding, and then the possibility of it showing up in the eggs if I took the male out and didn't leave the male to attend to the eggs. Then if I left the male in to tend to the eggs, generally never really had any kind of fungal problems. They generally kept things circulated, moving around. They're pretty attentive fathers, so they do a pretty good job of that. But if I ever was just pulling out the bubble nests and dropping them into buckets, and just to hatch them over here, fungal city, that just generally was. And with eggs, once you really get fungus in there, good luck. There just really isn't any salvaging it. And so but that was the most common time I would ever see fungus with betas. Bacterial was always the problem with the betas. Was always the biggest concern that I always had, was bacterial stuff, not so much fungus. But as you said, the other thing was guppies. I have definitely seen my fair share of crazy fungal outbreaks with the guppies. And I think you might agree with me, you might disagree with me on this, but I generally see things. Okay, good. It's good that you disagree. Generally, I see stuff like fungal infection showing up in breeder type fish. You know what I mean? Like the heavy breeder that may or may not be considered like in the world, out in the world of the environment as a fish that is more a food a food source for most other fish.
Like a more man-made fish, or like one that's just been bred a lot to make more fish?
One that breeds a lot, like small live bears and stuff like that. Generally, they breed a lot because out in the environment, they're typically food for other fish. I have a tendency to see that more than sort of more dominant predatorial fish, but it could just be a weird observation. I would really have to do a crazy experiment to figure that out.
Yeah.
And it would take 20 years before I got done with it.
I think when it comes to guppies, why we see so many bacterial infections is because they're a fish that tolerates so much salt. They can be raised in that. Mm-hmm. And then we get them here in our pet stores at our homes with almost no salt. Oh, I've got mic issues? Uh-oh.
You do. You're crackly.
Uh-oh. I don't know. I didn't change anything, though.
I'm going to have to take over the show because your mic's crackly.
Could be internet problem. I don't know what to do. Will you talk?
Let me see what's going on. Okay. Well, let's see what you were. I'm trying to finish your sentences for you.
I think they're raised in brackish water and they're crashing.
Yeah, that's probably a big reality of if you are picking up fish like at the store. If you're buying a heavily bred fish like that at the store, they more often than not are adding salt to their water and stuff like that, and then you bring it home to your pristine sort of home aquarium with your brand new water, or maybe you just did a water change, where you maybe just did a bunch of water changes in preparation for your fish coming home. But that is something that I would always test if you are going to be picking up a fish from a store or anything like that. Always test the water. Find out what their water parameters are before you bring them home, so at least it'll give you a chance to at least emulate and possibly move forward on adapting these fish to your new environment if you were to bring them home from a store. And one of the easy ways to do that, to get the store to test the water, is bring a vial with you. This is kind of an underhanded trick, you guys, so pay attention. Bring a little vial with you and scoop some water out of the tank, and then ask them to test the water for you. Don't tell them where it's from. Just say, hey, I have this water here. Can you test it for me? And more often than not, stores will test it. They will generally say they don't want to test their own water, but they'll normally test water for free on site. So that's just a little tip to people out there, that if you're looking to get some of or to get the water parameters of where you purchase your fish from, that is an easy way to go about it. So you can check from the store there and then go, oh man, they got salt, their pH is really high or something, or whatever may or may not be a little bit different from your home aquarium. And you'll be coming in with a little more information. And or you could always just buy the fish and then test a little bit of the water when you get home. But more often than not, they've kind of pooped and peed in that water, and a lot of stress going on in that water. So you probably get some weird readings from the little bag, the little bag of water that you brought home. So maybe that's a hot tip. Is your mic fixed yet?
I have no idea.
It's crackly.
Yeah.
Rice Krispies. Yeah. Brought to you by Corey. Rice Krispies. Delicious.
The problem is I can't leave and rejoin, because that'll just shut the entire stream down.
That'll shut the whole shebang. But yeah, you're doing that crackly. You're doing that crackly thing that you were doing earlier, and I think that is internet. I think our internet is a little bit jacked from the big storm yesterday. We had a big hearty storm. I did see something explode up the street last night, which was pretty fantastic.
We had 2 explosions, yeah.
And the power didn't go out, which makes me think hopefully it's just Comcast and not my CenturyLink, right? Hopefully Comcast has to fix a bunch of stuff.
Let me unplug my mic, and then I'm going to plug it back in. And if there's no audio, the show ends. If it's fine, then we keep going. I'm going to just unplug it and plug it back in. We'll see how it goes.
You got to try the old plug it, unplug it trick.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a super chat here. I'm going to read real quick from Brendan's Life. In the professional beta world, isn't it common to lower the pH to keep infections away, such as fin rot? Maybe another part for this conversation. In my experience, I have seen, I guess the answer would be that I've not necessarily seen, I certainly have not seen everything, but I have seen pretty much every variation of weird water quality and weird water quality concerns from, and of course, never name any names, but from the breeders I've seen out there, I've seen all sorts of weird water quality. And as I was kind of talking about earlier, lowering pH a little bit in a beta aquarium is always kind of a little bit important, as in my mind the correlation is growing my plants. Having a little bit lower pH just allows the plant uptake to work a little bit better, and those two things would go in conjunction. But I've never really seen anybody go specifically lower for in a professional breeding facility or anything like that. It would typically cost more money, and more often than not, most of the betas that we see hit the market here in the US, Canada, or anything like that, is coming from these kind of strange facilities where, Corey held up that water bottle earlier, where most of actual bettas and stuff like that are actually bred just in a bunch of water bottles. And so it would cost them a ton of money to change the pH in those water bottles. And typically they just let them be the way that they are. So I've never really seen anybody put a ton of work into it, except for I did see one of our local breeders here would do it kind of a natural way. So you essentially just be adding, almond leaves and things of that nature to bring the pH down a little bit in his big breeding facilities. But those were generally a community style breeding tank. So what he would do is he had a lot of males, a lot of females in big these big like Rubbermaid holding tanks. So they were more like sort of like a pond situation than anything else. And so he had a lot of males, a lot of females, and would feed live food almost exclusively. So you'd actually just grow mosquitoes and mosquito larvae and all that kind of stuff, dump them in there, and just essentially let them breed. And because of that, his pH was a little bit lower, but it really wasn't. It really wasn't like. It wasn't really as I've seen as a specific reason to cut out a fungal infection or anything like that. It just was generally a little bit healthier environment for him. How's your mic doing?
We'll see. I plugged it.
It's back to normal.
Okay, then.
The Rice Krispies is gone.
Perfect.
What'd you do? Did you just go get some milk?
I literally unplugged it, drop kicked it, and then plugged it back in. You couldn't hear the drop kick because the mic was unplugged.
It was unplugged, right? So you did a karate chop.
But anyway, I think so. We're getting towards the end of the show now that we've had the mic problems. But the goal is prevention, and I think reducing stress. So we've talked about temperature. We talked about like stress from guppies or breeding too much or coming from what had salinity, that type of thing. But in general, I think aggressive fish, like a lot of times I witness a fungal infection like an African cichlid tank. And it's just because dominant male is maybe dominating the food, beating up on some people. I can see it in catfish a lot of times where columnaris, common in corridor catfish. And it's where sometimes gravel is either too sharp, which, that's half the problem. I find the real problem is the gravel bed or the substrate bed isn't very clean. Like there's a lot of detritus and just, not a good thing going on down there. So maybe gravel vacuuming a little more could help. I'm trying to think of other instances where I know that it's mostly I don't want to call it neglect. It's something we could have done to prevent it type of thing. Besides, fish getting old, there being, an environmental effect like we've talked about a bunch of, and there could be a million things, by the way. It could be that you just put a brand new big screen TV next to your tank and you're watching, professional wrestling, and someone drop kicks someone else and then it vibrates the tank and there's all that stress going on. Like there's a lot of things. You install a new light, there's all kinds of stuff, but stress in general lowers the immune system. We've all felt that. We go to work, we work 60 hours in a week. All of a sudden we got a cold the following week. And then I think the other big one is, I don't want to call it expired food, but old food. So often, at least in my store, people walk in and be like, well, I need the U-Haul truck full of flake food because I save per ounce. Meanwhile, they're feeding off the same food. I've had people where literally they come in and like the expiration was 8 years ago, and it's still like they got half the flake food still in the can. Meanwhile, we're trying to diagnose like why all the fish are having like a kind of a myriad of different problems, like, oh, fungal infection, bloated eye on this one just won't eat, this one's doing this thing, this one's got dropsy. And one of the important things I think to remember is fish food has lots of fish and oils and things like that. And so I try and tell people, treat your fish food like you would treat human food. So a lot of times put it in the fridge, and if you're going to keep it out, if it's like a loaf of bread, how long do you have before it starts molding and going bad a little bit? Like maybe a couple of weeks, and things are meant to be stabilized longer than that. But I find in our typical lives, we get so busy if we're not trying to be proactive, pretty soon you do have the food you're feeding out, and it's like, oh, it's been 14 months. Like, oh, dang, I swear I bought that just a couple of months ago, and so that will lead to it.
And also a point I've mentioned this in the past to a few people is that when you are feeding from, like, for instance, like a jar with a lid, it's like a little container with a lid. It's a great way to keep the moisture out of it and stuff. What I've seen in the past from people that are kind of getting into feeding their fish and stuff like that is they forget and go into the jar with their wet hand. Is that maybe you're doing multiple tanks, right? And if you're like me, I normally, when I have some food in my hand, I normally break the surface so that it actually does
You're
go.
a madman.
So it actually goes in. It doesn't float all around on just the top. But just remember, you got to dry your hand off before, if you're going into that jar, go in there with dry hands. That's always a great opportunity to introduce either a mold or a fungus or something like that from your food, which I've actually had happen with one of my shrimp colonies one time. I was trying to figure out where the kind of the mold fungus was being reintroduced into the tank, and it turned out there's some moisture had accumulated at the bottom of the bag of food that I was using. I was using actually these pellets at the time, and as I dumped it out, I realized that just to keep it kind of simple, half of the bottom of the bag was all stuck in there, right? And it was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? So the stuff at the top was dry, probably had a lot of fungus and mold spores all over it, but you probably wouldn't notice. And then the bottom of it, once I cut the bag open, it was like, oh, that's heinous at the bottom. That's gross. So I've had that happen before, and that's from going back into the bag without dry hands. So just remember that. Just a little thing to remember that. It'll also save you money, realistically. If you just get water in there and you ruin all the food, then you got to go buy more food. So not only will it save money, but it will also help keep your food a little bit nicer over time.
Yeah. So someone said, is mulm the same thing as detritus, stuff like that? I'm not sure that there's an official definition for mulm, but in my mind, mulm is like dirt. Like, it's the last broken down step, where detritus might be that dead leaf, that snail shell, that piece of uneaten food, like debris type of thing, where mulm is like, mulm, in my opinion, is like what we clean out of, let's say, sponges and our filters, like that chocolate milk water. That's pretty much mulm. It's light and fluffy and stuff like that. And I guess maybe the definition of mulm is I can no longer tell what it once was. Where if I put a cardboard box into my compost pile or something, like a pizza box, if I look at it and I still see that it was a pizza box, in my mind, that's debris or detritus, where when it is just dirt, then it's mulm to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I guess my little fun appraisal of the difference between detritus and mulm would be like, mulm is at the point where the only thing that's going to affect it is bacteria, right? Like, it's broken down to the point where as it's breaking down further, you're not going to be able to see it. You're just not going to be able to see that happen because it's all at a molecular level. It's a bacterial level. Whereas detritus would just be leftover food, maybe some dead, plant matter or whatever kind of nonsense stuff that's actually pretty easy to get at. And mulm would almost be like, if you took it out and kind of dried it, it feels sort of like makeup. If you've ever had like a little bit of makeup on your hands, that's kind of what it feels like once it's dried from the tank. It's kind of, it's like really fine.
We should make that natural makeup line.
We should do that. Actually, that's a good idea. Now
it's gonna be full of like omega-3s and all those like lipids and all those good things, right?
Yeah, it's gonna smell terrific.
Yeah.
Find your lady down here with the fish mulm makeup line. She smells delicious.
All natural.
Oh, natural. That's right. Well, most makeup is actually made out of old used proteins and stuff like that.
Yeah, tires.
Well, actually, like frying oil.
I believe that. It's like Fight Club, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. What else? Do we have anything about fungal infections. I feel like we could prevent at least 50% of all fungal infections. Another 40% should be easily be treatable with mild medicine / salts. And then I feel like that last 10%, when it's be like, man, I have a chronic problem, is we haven't addressed the cause of the problem, right? So like the problem is fungus, but why do we have fungus reoccurring or not going away? And I think that's one of those, environmental factors or food issues. I think if you were to like go through all of those and you could check off each one you're doing right, you probably wouldn't have a fungal infection anymore.
Yeah, probably. I mean, you're essentially just trying to boost the health of the fish, which you're trying to do anyhow, right? I mean, that's the goal anyhow. Oops, sorry about that. That was weird. But you're essentially trying to just boost the health of your critters in your aquarium so they can actually just fight off the fungus. Like I was saying earlier, as people, we have fungus all over our skin, but does it take advantage of us? Not typically, unless you're in a stressed unless you're in a real stressed physically environment. That's the wrong word. Real stressed condition as a person, which may or may not be age related, that kind of stuff. So, remember to take that into account with your fish. You're trying to just keep everybody healthy up until old age, and then maybe move them to a senior center tank where they can live out their senior years peaceably.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take my old tiger barbs and put them in a senior center over here. But yeah, so, and which is our goal anyhow of keeping the fish and all that kind of stuff, is to try and just get their health up. So I don't think it's a bad thing to have, like, a fungal infection take hold. I think it's just kind of the slap on the wrist of like, oh, wait a minute, maybe I should change a couple things, and maybe
attention getter.
Yeah, that little attention getter that's not super scary, right? It's not like what am I trying to think of? It's not like Scarlet,
Right.
It's not super scary.
Fungal infections don't transfer that easy unless it is a poor environment and everything's just compromised. Like if you just have like one fish that got beat up or something happened, you just go, oh, fungal infection in that fish. That's the sign. Like, well, at least this one fish cannot fight this off. Maybe it's 2 months down the road, none of my fish could. So is it my food? Is it the water? Is it just this one fish? Is it my dominant male peacock is beating everything within an inch of its life? It should just be that didn't go well. It's not even that it should go away. Like usually it shouldn't form. Like the fish probably get wounds and fungal infections and stuff all the time. It's when we notice it that they didn't have the right tools or whatever to fight it off, so that should be the clue in a working, just like if we cut our hand or something, it's going to scab up and heal over, and that's how it should work. And when that doesn't work, we know, oh man, we've really done something wrong here. Probably either bacteria got in at the beginning, or we're not keeping it clean, or something wrong has gone on, but So, all right. Well, I think we're at the 1 hour mark. I apologize for the mic. That is the problem we have being remote. We kind of knew it was going on, but we've had troubles in the past with mics, and doing it over the internet is quite difficult. Someone asked here, like, what does it take to get 4K live streams? And first, I'll say that YouTube doesn't even allow that yet. 2K is the highest, and in this studio where I am currently, we have that capability. The problem is it takes a lot of money. And like my business is funding that part of the money. But I basically have a $300 internet connection, and it's still not even that fast. I can't get fiber or anything like that. And $800 worth of software with a $300 camera. And if we wanted to do that for this, for instance, Joel would have to get a $300 camera, because it's got to be able to go up to that high resolution. Have to have a faster internet connection, because that's just what he's going to have. So he's into it every month at least, probably $250 or $200 more just for the faster internet connection. And that's, not not beating the dead horse here, but that is what the Patreon goes towards, is like right now, just running the show with the podcast hosting, iHeartRadio, internet connection, and stuff like that. On a monthly basis, I'm at about $450. Like, so every month I pay $450 just so that you guys can listen to this. And unfortunately, there's no free way. I was actually shocked to learn that if I just put it on YouTube, YouTube pays me. To put it out in podcast form, I have to pay for it, which is kind of crazy. So that's the infrastructure problem. And then there's the whole doing stuff remotely is always more difficult. We're actually working and talking and putting money towards and slowly building a space where we could do a show like this in person, make it be flawless. You guys can see us both on the same camera. We can do those types of things. We can have more people on the show. But all of it costs money, more mics, more things, we got to build. That takes time. You've seen Joel over here time and time again. Unfortunately, it's, every time he drives up, 40 or 50 bucks, which isn't a huge amount of money. But when we have probably 20 or 30 more days worth of building to make something like that happen, you're going, well, that's like over $1,000 just in gas. Meanwhile, he can't, work or do anything like that because he's working for me. So either A, I got to pay him, or B, he's got to donate time, which he's done. We've done both aspects of that. And so yeah, it's a work in progress. We're working on it. And trust me, we want to bring you the best we possibly can. And, we'll get there when we can get there. Every day, we pretty much get another Patreon supporter, which is cool, even if it's only $1, or if you share something out, or you subscribe on the podcast, all those things. Like, if we don't do anything at all, over time, a year from today, we'll be bigger and we probably have a better show just because X amount of people will have contributed in some way. And it's just a waiting game, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also the big point that I always have is that I wish that we could have a 4K sparkly finished product like right off the bat. I would love that too. But as you mentioned, YouTube doesn't even let us do in 4K yet. But someday we'll be up at the 2K mark, and we'll have dedicated lines and all that kind of stuff to kind of do a better resolution and all that kind of stuff. One of the things I've been working on here is having a dedicated stream setup so that I'm able to broadcast a little bit better, so that Corey and I can connect and have a set up a little bit better, so that nothing ever changes as far as that that setup goes and stuff. So we're definitely working on it. We're gonna keep getting better and better. I know a lot of people have been asking me, hey, when are you gonna have other people on the show? Someday. I don't know when. Someday. But it really comes down to just putting in the hours, and as Corey said, we're definitely been up there. Not slaving away. That's the wrong word, because when you're slaving, you got a frown on your face. Which I would have to say that neither Corey nor I have had a frown on our face. Yeah. So slaving's probably the wrong word. Maybe just working real hard. Sooner we can get that kind of stuff going, the better, and we're definitely on it. So, So that stuff's coming. And somebody was asking earlier on, what about the Google Live? I don't know about the Google Live, whether or not, because this goes out. Some people listen on Google. What is it? The Google Listen. What's that app called?
I would have to look into it.
The Google app, because they were saying that, hey, we always talk about iTunes, but what about the Google? Because I know a lot of people listen on the Google host or whatever. So, I mean, I know there's anything that you guys want to do. If there's something that you're into, like Facebook or the Google Plus or whatever you guys like, throw a like or an ad or a recommendation or a share or any of that kind of stuff out there. I know I've talked to a lot of people that go like, well, I don't know anybody who's into fish stuff. Doesn't matter. Maybe people are just into listening to two dudes talk about whatever. So as Corey was saying earlier, just get the like, get the share, get that moved out there. And before you know it, we'll be able to fly in some weirdos from Lord knows where and grill them for days at a time. Right.
I do like grilled weirdos.
We need to know everything you know.
Yeah. So I'll look into it. I'm on the Google Play right now. They've got movies and TV and apps and stuff like that. I don't see anything for podcasts, but the easiest way to get through the chatter is hop onto one of our Patreons and go, "Hey guys, here's a link to what I'm talking about," and then we'll chase it down and go, "Oh yeah, we could do that." I mean, like obviously, we have a dedicated app on Android and on iOS, and there's iTunes, and there's Stitcher, and there's iHeartRadio, and a million other ones. But if there's one that you really love, and all I got to do is click a button like, "Oh, let me submit it to here," we can totally do that for you. It's mostly like I know right now there's over 1,000 places I could submit it, but it might be one of those things like, well, Geraldine's grandma's podcasting list is not exactly the up and coming source to find podcasts, so I don't spend my time there.
The knitting podcast.
Yeah. Knitters Unite. So, well, thank you guys. I think the next episode we're about to shoot is we're going to talk about fish foods, and we gave you probably a little bit of a preview and a snippet of it today, but we're going to delve into it. I've got tons of opinions. Everyone wants to know what's the best, and we'll save it for that. So, thanks for joining us. We will work on this technological difficulties. Today happens to be still aftermath from the $800 software we use. They produced an update, and you're going, well, you're using Google Hangouts. Yes, the update broke the system. So it's one of those things where you fight with the developers going, well, it worked. We changed nothing last week, and now it doesn't work. And they go, well, could you tell us why it's not working? And the answer is no, because it's not working. Like we literally can't even get to that point where we could diagnose. So hopefully they come out with an update this week, and next week you're going, sweet Jiminy Christmas, you guys are in 2K or you're in 1080p at least.
No.
We're trying, and we will get there. So thank you for your patience, and I promise you at some point this will be dialed in, and we will be your new favorite thing to eat. It's the same every time. It's so good. If I had more money, I'd eat it more often. So
that's right.
All right, guys. Well, Jimmy, go ahead and send us off into space land.
Space